would invite at this time, as the children are leaving for children's time, we have a number of people who are going to help us with our scripture lesson today, which comes from 1 Samuel. This is the very familiar text of the story of David and Goliath. And we have a King Saul, and we have a David, and we have a Philistine who is Goliath. And I guess since you're small, we should have had you be David with your size there. But we have probably the largest David in the room here. So. That was a compliment. He's going to be able to take on, or either that or Goliath needs to kind of be working out and being more buff here. Okay, so we start with David in our reading now from 1 Samuel.
David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine."
Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from youth."
But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David,
"Go, and may the Lord be with you."
Excellent. Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them.
Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them."
So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and pulled them into his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance.
The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?"
And the Philistine cursed David by his gods.
The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the field."
But David said to the Philistine,
"You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead body of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand."
When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And thank you also to our actors. Robert Kearns was a professor at Wayne State University, and in his spare time, he enjoyed inventing items. One of those items was the intermittent windshield wiper. Kearns's design was simple, brilliant, and patented. Kearns peddled his prototype to the big automakers, and they promptly began to ignore the patent, installed the windshield wiper that Kearns had developed, and failed to pay Kearns for doing so. Kearns was so upset by this that he suffered a nervous breakdown, but then he declared war. He became his own attorney, and he sued Ford and Chrysler and was victorious to the tune of about $30 million. Now, Kearns never got to fulfill his initial desire, which was to manufacture these windshield wipers on his own. However, he did get a movie made of his life story that played a couple of years ago. And Americans, we all love stories like this, don't we? Stories of underdogs, whether it's in the movies or sports or in business or everyday life. We cheer those who rise up in the midst of circumstances that seem to be insurmountable or seem to be stacked heavily against them. And we cheer when they, as the underdogs, prevail over all of those odds and have their victory. The story that we just read from 1 Samuel, the story of David and Goliath, that has to be the underdog story of all time. Even people who have never read the Bible, who have never gone to church, people in the culture refer to David and Goliath. They know that David, the story of the young boy who prevailed over his super-sized opponent with a single stone that was well placed and slung from his slingshot. But as we, and people who simply know that it was a victory of David over Goliath, as we rush to celebrate that victory, sometimes we overlook or don't pay as much attention to the details of the story and of how really amazing and astonishing what David was able to do. David wasn't just smaller. David wasn't just less experienced. David wasn't just less equipped and trained. And David wasn't just being taunted and discouraged by his opponents. David also had to contend with that chorus of naysayers in his own camp, starting with his brothers who resented him being there in the first place and were curious, if we went back a few passages before what we read, as to what his motives were. And then the naysaying of the king himself, as David volunteers to be the champion for the Israelites, and his own camp says, "You can't do it. Don't even try. You're not worthy of this. We don't think that you can do it." And David simply shrugged it off. David knew that God would be with him. David knew that the battle was the Lord's, and David had faith that God would see him through. And so we come to our text this morning. We begin in verse 32, and David is saying to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Now, the Israelites and the Philistines had been neighbors and had been unhappy neighbors for some time. The centuries of distrust and animosity, occasionally erupting into armed battle against each other. In the most previous confrontation, in a previous generation, the Philistines had routed the Israelites and stolen the Ark of the Covenant. God's response to that was to pour out his wrath on each of the cities where the ark was temporarily housed. And as we come to our text this morning, the Israelites are preparing to fight the Philistines again, this time in the valley of Elah. The Philistines this time, though, had a warrior who was of remarkable size and strength. This was Goliath of Gath. Now, Gath happens to be one of the cities that was destroyed by God for housing the ark. So Goliath is not only big, Goliath is mad. He's got a score to settle with God. The Philistines are so confident that the Israelites have no one that can match Goliath, that they offer this unusual arrangements where they say that if you send out your champion to fight our champion Goliath, we'll let that settle the battle between us this time. A mano, winner take all, high stakes kind of a battle. And over a number of days, Goliath had been preening and taunting and challenging the Israelites to send out their challenger, their champion, who would take on Goliath. And no one would do so. The Israelites had no one who would step forward until David. David comes forward and he says, I'll do it. Verse 33, Saul says to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine, to fight with him. You're just a boy, and he's been a warrior from his youth. Before David could even attempt to fight Goliath, he had to fight those who were discouraging him from even trying. He's too small, too young, too inexperienced, didn't have the right training or equipment. He was sure to lose. We all face our own giants in our lives every day. Giants that have names like illness or addiction or unemployment or debt or marital troubles. And like David, we contend in the face of those giants, not only with the battle that we must have with that giant, but with our own chorus of voices that are always doing for us what Saul did to David, discouraging us before we even can begin. The voices that tell us things like, well, you know, that cancer is almost always terminal. Or, you know, there aren't a lot of jobs out there for people your age. Or, well, you've never been able to quit before. What makes you think you can quit now? Or, you know, everybody is walking away from their mortgages and their debts. Why don't you just go ahead and declare bankruptcy like everyone else? Or, well, some people just aren't good at relationships. David's response to that discouragement in his life was to say, you know, you're right. I haven't fought Goliath, but I have, with God's help, prevailed over some other pretty ferocious opponents in the past. And David begins to tell Saul about his life as a shepherd boy. He says, your servant has killed both lions and bears. The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine. David had seen how God had protected David in the past in lesser ways, if you can call being attacked by a lion or a bear lesser. And David had learned from those experiences to put his confidence, to put his trust, to put his faith in God, that God had protected him in the past and God would continue to protect him. David put his confidence in God, not in himself. And there's a slight difference there, one that I would like to try and illustrate with a situation that we had when we went hiking a number of years ago. If you're familiar with the hiking trailheads, there's always some kind of instructions or lists of recommendations from the Forest Service, and they post that on a sign. Well, we went hiking in an area that was known to have cougars in it. And so there was a list of the things that you should do if you were confronted by a cougar while on the trail. And they are not the same things that you would do if you were confronted by a bear. We're perhaps more familiar with that, where you are to go down and play dead. Not what you do with a cougar. Apparently that's just lunch for a cougar. A cougar, you are supposed to look back at them, be aggressive, make yourself look bigger, put your arms up. Don't break the confrontation with them. And ultimately, it goes through 1 through 2, 3, 4, 5, and the very last one is fight back aggressively. That's the last on the list. Fight back aggressively. That is putting confidence in yourself. Seems to me that there's another one, number 11, that the government did not list on that one, which is pray feverishly. Pray feverishly or fervently at this point. That's putting your confidence in God, not in yourself. And so Saul says to David, okay, go and may the Lord be with you. And so Saul clothed David with Saul's own armor, put a bronze helmet on David's head, clothed him with a coat of mail, strapped his own sword over David's armor. And yet David, once he is burdened by all of this armor, quickly realizes that it is more of an encumbrance than a help. Saul is not convinced that David's going to prevail, but Saul can't let David go into the battle unprotected. So he gives David his own armor, the weapons that he thinks, that Saul thinks David needs for the battle. And yet, David's not a soldier. David's a shepherd, and having the helmet that obscures his visibility and the weight of this coat of mail on him, and having to wield this sword, this heavy sword, the king's sword, that he was not trained to use, David realizes that this is merely an encumbrance and not a help. David has been called to fight as he is equipped to fight, as a shepherd, not as a soldier, with a slingshot and not a sword. When it comes to the church to help people face the giants of their own sin and brokenness, when we in the church try and help people in facing their own giants of sin and brokenness, too often we are like Saul. We give people the weapons that maybe have worked for us or for our generation, without listening to what the needs of that other person or that next generation might be. And to be quite candid, the next generation, as we are all becoming much more aware, they reject the sword of condemnation. They're having nothing to do with the sword of condemnation. They would prefer shepherds' staffs of compassion and care. As a church, we need to be providing and equipping this next generation with the weapons that they need to fight their own giants of sin and brokenness. Verse 40, David took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi, which is the river, and put them in his shepherd's bag. Took his sling in his hand, and he drew near to Goliath. David said to Goliath, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And there are a couple more verses of Goliath looking and going, you got to be kidding me. What are you, coming at me with a stick like I'm a dog? And then David, in verse 49, took out a stone, slung it, and struck Goliath on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. With no armor to protect himself, David had to rely on God. He was dependent on God's protection. He didn't have any other choice. When we give up our armor, when we give up the things that we believe will protect us, but do not, in fact, protect us, when we strip away all those things that we cling to and become wholly dependent on God, that is when we experience the greatest spiritual growth. That's when we are able to begin to prevail over our giants. A number of years ago, I was privileged to serve in jail ministry, and when you are arrested and brought to jail, you see very quickly that the things that you thought would protect you do not actually protect you. You become, in a forced way, to become more dependent on God. And for some people arrested, this means that their pimps or their dealers or their abusers, the people that they thought were protecting them, were not actually protecting them. For some people that may perhaps have money and places of privilege in society and find themselves ensnared in the criminal justice system through a DUI or through an embezzlement or some other kind of misdeed, they also experience the same thing, that the things that they thought were going to protect them, their money and power and privilege, those things are false as well. We don't have to, thankfully, go to jail to learn that lesson when we acknowledge that the things that protect us are not really the armor that we think they are. It's when we take away that pretense of being able to be self-sufficient, to be self-centered instead of Christ-centered. That's when our spiritual growth is amazing as well. The story of David and Goliath has such universal and enduring appeal because it offers us hope, offers all of us when we recognize how much smaller we are than the giants in our lives, much smaller. It gives us hope. But we need to, like David, put our faith in God. The story gives us hope for all of us who are underdogs to defeat our own giants, whatever they might be. If we remember, like David, to not let others discourage us, and to remember to put our confidence in God and not ourselves. Have faith as David had faith, and we will be able to overcome the giants in our lives.